The human mind, consciousness, still represent an unfathomable mystery today, unlike those who think that the topic of consciousness and its unfathomable mysteries are just material for pseudoscientists. The most influential governments in the world have funded multiple research projects for many years, which have produced thousands of experiments. The most famous of these experiments is undoubtedly the Stargate project. Some of you probably know about it, may have read some articles, or watched some videos on the internet, and have learned, as a result, that these were experiments carried out during a specific historical period when international tensions, fear of the enemy, and the race for military and geopolitical supremacy allowed the boundaries of scientific research to be expanded. And this gave several scientists the opportunity to propose experiments considered bizarre by mainstream science, which aimed to investigate the most mysterious and controversial aspects of the human mind. If you think this, you most likely learned about the existence of this series of revolutionary and extraordinary experiments from third-party sources that did not go into the subject in depth. If you trust our work and follow us as we share this incredible journey, we are sure that your perception of what the human mind really is and what these experiments have meant will completely change. Well, before we continue with the story, as we always do, and if you haven't done it yet, we invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos and to support our work. The Stargate project was a top-secret operation carried out by American intelligence. Actually, it wasn't a single project, but a series of projects that over the years changed names and are known by the name Gondola, Wish Grill, Flame Center Lane, Dragoon, Absorb, Sunstreak, and finally Stargate. These research programs began in 1972 and ended in 1995 with the Stargate project. The main goal was to investigate parapsychology, that is, psychic abilities and related paranormal phenomena. Phenomena such as psychokinesis, which is the ability to influence the physical world with the power of the mind alone, or remote viewing, which is the ability to observe and acquire information about inaccessible places or events located anywhere on Earth. As we'll see, things will exceed expectations and more. The results of the experiments will be shocking and will revolutionize everything we think we know about our consciousness and its origin. But now let's take a step back and try to understand how this incredible story began. It's the early 1970s. The world is split into two blocks, the Western Bloc led by the United States and the Soviet Union. With every event or clash between the two powers, the whole world trembles. The fear is that at any moment a global apocalyptic nuclear conflict could break out. The 1970s came right after the Cultural Revolution that brought to the forefront issues and topics that had never been considered before. Civil rights and individual freedoms are sparking protests worldwide and more. Among these, New Age thought emerges, which is a heterogeneous mix of beliefs, spiritual and philosophical practices, combining elements of Eastern spirituality, Western esotericism, ecology, humanistic psychology, and mysticism. At a time in history when paranoia about the enemy's actions is at its highest level, United States intelligence reports state that the Soviets have been conducting rigorous government-funded studies on psychic phenomena at least since 1920. CIA reports also confirm that the Soviets are making rapid progress in this field, and this is supported by the significant increase in funding, which has more than quadrupled in recent years. This is therefore the historical context that led the United States to seriously consider parapsychology as a potential resource for intelligence gathering and military operations. At this point, it's important to emphasize that everything that follows is the result of studying a portion of the documentation produced by United States intelligence, which has only been declassified in recent years. Those seeking more information can find references in the video description. The Stargate project began with two renowned scientists, Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ. Harold Puthoff, who graduated from Stanford University with a doctorate in electrical engineering, was renowned for his advancements in the field of quantum electronics and zero-point energy. Russell Targ was a pioneer in early laser research during the 1960s. Both scientists shared an interest in topics related to the occult and parapsychology. The Stanford Research Institute had long been involved in government-funded projects, often top secret, but never in the field of parapsychology, at least until some unexpected events led to the experiments. As Puthoff recounts, it all began in 1972.
At the beginning of 1972, I became involved in laser research at the Stanford Research Institute. At that time, there was also a proposal circulating to obtain a small grant for some research in the field of quantum biology. In that proposal, I had raised the question of whether physical theory, as we knew it, was able to describe vital processes, and I had suggested some measurements involving plants and lower organisms. This proposal circulated widely, and a copy was sent to Cleve Baxter of New York City, who was involved in measuring the electrical activity of plants with standard polygraph equipment. The New York artist Ingo Swann happened to see my proposal during a visit to Baxter's laboratory, and he wrote to me suggesting that if I was interested in investigating the boundary between the physics of the animate and the inanimate, I should consider parapsychological experiments. Swann then went on to describe some apparently successful psychokinesis experiments he had participated in at Professor Gertrude Schmeidler's laboratory at City College of New York. As a result of this correspondence, I invited him to visit my laboratory for a week in June 1972 to demonstrate these effects. Honestly, mostly due to personal scientific curiosity.
At this point in the story, Ingo Swann's arrival changes everything. Swann, a New York artist and psychic, is truly sui generis. As we'll see, he will be crucial to advancing the project that involves the CIA. To test Swann's paranormal abilities, Puthoff ensured access to the magnetometer in Stanford University's physics department. The magnetometer is a device that measures magnetic fields. Swann's task would be to manipulate the magnetic field around it. Basically, this can be considered an ideal instrument to test the abilities of those who claim to be able to produce physical effects using only the power of the mind. And it was precisely this instrument that was used when Swann went to visit Puthoff at Stanford. Puthoff describes what happened in these words.
When Swann focused his attention on the inside of the magnetometer, the output signal was visibly disturbed, indicating a change in the internal magnetic field. Many other correlations were observed between his mental efforts and the signal variations. These variations were never seen before or after the visit.
The fact that Swann was able to alter the magnetic field amazed everyone who witnessed the experiment. But what truly left everyone speechless was when Swann, through what would later be called remote viewing, managed to draw on a sheet of paper all the internal components that made up the machine.
This last feat impressed me even more than the previous one.
This experiment, which had left everyone who witnessed it speechless, would only be published 3 years after it was carried out. But Dr. Puthoff still circulated a draft among his colleagues, and someone, we don't know exactly who, secretly sent a copy to the authorities. A short time later, impressed by the results of the experiment, they contacted Puthoff and began a whole series of tests to assess Swann's real abilities.
They told me that the intelligence community was increasingly concerned about the level of commitment to parapsychology in the Soviet Union, funded by the Soviet security services. According to Western scientific standards, the field was considered an absurdity by most active scientists. As a result, they were looking for a research laboratory outside the academic world, capable of handling a quiet, low-profile, confidential investigation. And our laboratory seemed to be a perfect match for this.
What we learn from Puthoff's words is that the CIA was strongly interested in the subject, but before funding the project, they wanted to have some concrete evidence. And for this reason, they sent several agents to the Stanford Research Center. Gradually, they moved from remote viewing of symbols or objects enclosed in envelopes or boxes to remote viewing of locations situated in the nearby San Francisco Bay. This is what is written in the final report of the program's second year. Thank you for.
Under controlled laboratory conditions, descriptions of targets were generated with sufficiently high quality to allow for blind matching of the descriptions to the targets by independent judges.
The purpose of the experiments was to clearly define the possibility of training agents to perform remote viewing through the mind. So, to create a method that would allow the formation of a team of agents capable of operating using only the potential of the human mind.
The strength of these results was further increased by the discovery that a growing number of individuals could demonstrate high-quality remote viewing, often to their own surprise.
The new agents were selected through a rigorous process. Initially, military personnel with emotional stability and psychic potential were chosen, and they underwent preliminary tests to assess their extrasensory abilities. And the promising candidates received theoretical training on the principles of remote viewing. The agents progressively practiced remote viewing exercises, from simple details to complex ones, participated in simulated missions, and, once ready, in operations. At this point, it's reasonable to ask how remote viewing worked. How could the agents obtain information about things they could neither see nor know? If so, how did they visualize places and objects? Did they develop real training protocols? Explaining why people achieve these results is more complex. To understand how this could happen, we need to introduce a new element, the matrix. The matrix is a key concept that represents the universal reservoir of information, or the field from which remote viewing practitioners draw their perceptions. This term has been used to describe a sort of universal psychic database that contains all information about any event, place, object, or person, regardless of time or space. In short, the agents were simply connecting to this source of universal information, the connected matrix. Everything would have become known as soon as we explained what these agents were capable of doing. We will come back to this topic so that the reason becomes clearer. All of this opens up new and revolutionary scenarios. However, what really interested the American intelligence was something much more tangible and less existential. The main goal of the program was to obtain information from places where access was forbidden, basically to spy on the enemy's moves. Swan, to bring the remote viewing technique to its fullest potential, he proposed a series of experiments in which the target to be viewed by the agents was designated. Through simple geographic coordinates, this technique was named coordinate scanning. Basically, the designated person was given the coordinates of a place they didn't know, and starting only from these, they had to visualize and describe the place. The idea that it could be possible for a remote viewing agent to observe a place, having only the coordinates, as information initially seemed impossible, but the experiments that followed were impressive. In July 1974, Agent Pat Price, one of the most gifted agents among those who had been selected, was chosen for the CIA's first operational remote viewing assignment. He was supposed to confirm the details of a Soviet nuclear laboratory, of which only photographs taken by a United States spy satellite were available. These are the words of the project manager, Dr. Kenneth Kress.
The target was the Unknown Research and Development Center of Semipalatinsk. The experimental collection would have used our best subject for experience. It was obvious that Price produced both incorrect and good data. I reviewed the photos of the site and chose two features that, if Price had described them, would have proven that the channel was at least partially working. These features were a very tall crane and the four structures that resembled oil well towers.
Initially, Price was only given the geographic coordinates and a map from the World Atlas with the approximate location of the site. He was told it was a Soviet test site. Price managed to produce a drawing that depicted a crane, which he described as damn big, because he had seen a person walk by its wheels. He managed to produce astonishing descriptions of the buildings under construction and the spherical sections of the tank, but he made no mention of the 4 structures that resembled oil wells.
At first, I find myself lying on my back on the roof of a 2- or 3-story brick building. It's a sunny day, and the sun feels nice. The most surprising thing is that there's a gigantic gantry crane moving back and forth above my head. When I get up and look down, it seems like there's a track on each side of the building. I've never seen anything like it.
Price's mission lasted several days, during which he drew elements later confirmed by spy satellite photos. Price was able to describe many structures that were confirmed by satellite photos, but he also made quite a few mistakes. Mistakes seemed to be a constant in remote viewing. In fact, while the agents were able to describe things that were impossible to know, on the other hand, there were also many incorrect descriptions. It's precisely the mistakes that are one of the main arguments for those who claim that the Stargate project was actually a failure. However, those who claim this deliberately underestimate a lot of objective data. And to explain this issue clearly, we're going to talk about it now, and we will do it. For example, let's talk about the experiment carried out by the CIA in the summer of 1973, which involved 2 agents, including Pat Price. The experiment began with the transmission of the geographical coordinates of a vacation property to the scientists at Stanford, which were given to them. The 2 agents were not allowed to use maps, and they were asked to give an immediate response about what they would see remotely. By viewing the site only through the coordinates, both agents claimed to have seen a military facility. So the description of the site turned out to be very different from what they actually should have seen. But the fact that both agents reported very similar details prompted the CIA men to go to the location to check, and they actually discovered that a government facility was present a short distance from the target objective. This discovery prompted the CIA men to ask Price to provide information about the internal workings of this particular site. Price, despite not having any military experience, managed to provide a list of all the projects associated with the activities that were being carried out inside the facility. He even produced the names of several classified projects kept in a locked underground cabinet, key along with others, despite the exact code name of the secret government facility, which in theory, he should never have known existed. The information uncovered by Price was so shocking that it led to a serious security investigation to find out how this information had leaked, but the result was inconclusive. There was no conceivable way for Price and the scientists on the project to have obtained any of these details. In this experiment, Price had managed to reproduce the project name and had accurately described documents that were kept protected in the basement of the facility. But at the same time, he had provided many incorrect descriptions. How was all this possible? How could he have pinpointed with such precision a name written on a classified document kept under lock and key, and then made so many other descriptive mistakes? Stanford scientists concluded, we must imagine the project. The simulator that Geometry Pride indicated with a global one, regulator with is which. The error? Honor dimensions? So it was the fault of the side of it. The thread happened for Surreally of psychic soldiers, which started the remote viewing operations under the guidance of the United States intelligence. Among psychic soldiers, besides those already mentioned, the most gifted and the only one documented is Joseph McMoneagle, known as Remote Viewer 001. Joseph McMoneagle. He got this nickname because he was the first remote viewer to work directly for the Pentagon. According to 2 declassified CIA documents, he worked on the project from 1979 to 1984. During his 5 years of remote viewing at Fort Meade, Joe McMoneagle claims to have participated in about 450 missions. He found hostages in Iran and helped free hostages in Italy. He carried out espionage activities on a Chinese nuclear laboratory, observed the Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi, and located a downed Soviet bomber that was carrying nuclear weapons. He also observed the previously unknown construction of the world's largest submarine, later called Typhoon, and accurately predicted that the Soviets would move it from the warehouse to the open ocean 4 months later, in mid-January 1980. That Joe McMoneagle made an important contribution to the missions he was called to collaborate on is easily deduced from the fact that the United States Army, after his retirement from the Stargate project, awarded him one of its highest honors, the Legion of Merit. But McMoneagle was different from the other agents. He seemed to possess an extra gift, a gift we can call precognition. That is, he had the ability to foresee events that would come true in the near future. To test these abilities, in 1978, Hal Puthoff gave him a special assignment that went beyond the classic intelligence missions. That year, it was expected that Skylab, the first American space station launched by National Aeronautics and Space Administration in 1973, due to some technical problems, would lose its stationary orbit and fall back to Earth. But no one knew the exact moment when this event would happen, nor where it would crash. Puthoff, to test McMoneagle's abilities, asked him to accurately predict when the space station would fall to Earth and where the impact would occur.
After working on the problem for a few days, I realized it was more complex than it seemed. It wasn't a simple answer like here and when, but in the end I produced a map that I gave to Scotty and also sent to Hal Puthoff. I had chosen a place in Australia, about 2/3 of the way west from the easternmost coast and about 1/3 of the way from the southern coast. I drew a pear-shaped area, with the narrower end and the wider end facing east, and I shaded the narrower end. And I said that was the point where the main pieces of the station would impact, while the larger end represented the debris field that would spread over an area about 1,500 miles long and about 60 miles wide. It was at the end of 1978 I had predicted that the re-entry would happen around July 5th, 1979. Skylab re-entered Earth's orbit on July 11th, 1979. I missed the main impact area, which was about 60 kilometers because the area I had selected was a bit further north, and I was also off by 6 days on the re-entry date.
The results of this experiment were astonishing, but this wasn't the only experiment outside of strictly military tasks that was assigned to the agents working on the Stargate project. As we mentioned earlier, the CIA subjected its agents to tests to understand their remote viewing abilities. And during one of these tests in 1973, Agent Ingo Swann was given a very particular task: to visualize and describe the planet, which had not yet been visited by space probes with detailed imaging capability. During the remote viewing session, Swann focused on Jupiter and began to describe his perceptions. Among his observations, he mentioned the presence of rings around the planet, a detail that at the time was not known to the scientific community. In 1979, 6 years after the experiment, National Aeronautics and Space Administration's Pioneer probe confirmed what Swann had said, transmitting some images of Jupiter that demonstrated the existence of a faint ring system around the planet. Once again, the test results left everyone speechless, but they didn't stop there. In 1984, Agent McMoneagle was given the geographic coordinates of the planet Mars and was asked to describe what he saw. Clearly, as with any remote viewing experiment, McMoneagle didn't know what place the coordinates referred to, and he began to describe an ancient civilization, including large pyramid-like structures, underground tunnels, and another energetic activity that in the distant past had belonged to a very ancient civilization. That would have suffered a terrible catastrophe and would have forced some of its members to seek refuge in other parts of the solar system. A similar experiment was also conducted with agents Ingo Swann and Pat Price. Both were asked to visualize the moon and describe it. Both, surprisingly, described the presence of artificial structures and mysterious activities on the lunar surface, including underground bases and operations that seem to belong to no known nation on Earth. The examples we've mentioned are just two that show that even though the Stargate project was funded mainly for military purposes, the results it achieved also had an impact on other fields, and they opened up unexpected questions, the most important of which is definitely what the Matrix was that the agents claimed to connect to. A place, if you can call it that, where it's possible to understand everything, and that would allow not only to view inaccessible sites, places thousands of kilometers away, but also to travel through time, sometimes consciously, as we saw with Skylab, other times unconsciously, as happened in the famous swimming pool experiment. During the swimming pool experiment, several agents were given the coordinates of a facility where there were two large pools. The agents described and drew the two pools very accurately. They also gave an accurate description of a purification system that wasn't actually at the site. Initially, it was thought to be a mistake, but later it was discovered that in the past the site had actually hosted a water purification system and that it had been dismantled. Many years before the remote viewing session, the purification system matched impressively with what the agents had drawn during the experiment. How did the agents see something that no longer existed? The answer lies in the very concept of the place matrix, where it is possible to acquire knowledge of everything from any time. Clearly, all this has enormous implications, because if such a place exists where it is possible to acquire information about everything, past, present, and future, it's inevitable to wonder if everything is already written and accomplished. It's also inevitable to wonder not only what this matrix is, but what our own mind is, and what we call consciousness. However, the Stargate program was not meant to study these aspects. It was strictly limited to military use. But even then, a question remains. Why was this revolutionary project stopped? The critics will say why. The CIA and the intelligence agencies realized that the results were not satisfactory and that it could all have simply been a delusion driven by the atmosphere of those years. But is it really like that? If you do a search on the internet, you'll find this among the most frequently mentioned reasons. But in reality, things are quite different, and that's what they themselves say. Reports were made by the experts appointed by the American government with the purpose of evaluating the results of the project. In 1995, the government commissioned an independent evaluation of the Stargate project to the American Institutes for Research. The evaluation was entrusted to two scientists, Jessica Utts and Ray Hyman. Dr. Jessica Utts concluded that psychic functioning had been demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt. Dr. Jessica Utts stated that further investigations were necessary to confirm such phenomena. The final assessment stated that despite the significant statistical results, listen carefully to these words, remote viewing was not useful for gathering intelligence, so the CIA ended the Stargate project. Before delving into these conclusions, let's make a premise. The experiments that were carried out during those years were conducted under strict supervision. A lot of work was done to try to make them not only repeatable in the laboratory, but also to create a precise protocol to follow. The fundamental problem was that despite the experiments, they produced incredible results that were hard to dispute. As we saw earlier, the descriptions given by the agents were affected by many errors, and moreover, they were not perfectly replicable. As we know, one of the distinguishing features of science is replicability. In the case of remote viewing experiments, this was not possible. To explain this situation, Dr. Jessica Utts provides an answer in her final report.
Few human behaviors are perfectly replicable on demand. For example, even the best hitters in Major League Baseball cannot hit on demand. Nor can we predict when someone will hit a home run. In fact, we can't even predict if a home run will happen in a given game. This doesn't mean that home runs don't exist. Scientific evidence in the field of statistics is based on the replication of the same performance or average relationship over the long term. A good baseball hitter won't hit the ball at exactly the same rate in every game, but he should be relatively consistent over the long term. The same should apply to mental functioning. Performance levels can vary depending on individual subjects and conditions, just like in baseball. But given subjects with similar abilities, tested under similar conditions, the results should be replicable over the long term in any area of science. Statistical evidence comes from comparing what actually happened with what should have happened by chance.
So if it's true that the results of experiments involving individual agents are not perfectly replicable, why would each experiment yield different results? If we analyze these statistically, just as we might do for a baseball player's performance, we'll see that they have statistical consistency. And, as the professor reminds us, evidence based on statistics is accepted by science. But then why was the Stargate project shut down? To put it simply, we can say that the Stargate project was shut down because the errors found in the agents' reports didn't make the information 100% reliable. And this didn't fully meet the purpose for which it was created, which was to spy and be certain about the enemy's intentions and actions. Something shocking comes out from these reports. The abilities demonstrated by the agents operating in remote viewing are statistically certain and real, even if they can't be reproduced. Moreover, the very nature of these visions, which have a margin of error, doesn't make them ideal for espionage operations. Those who witnessed the experiments do not doubt that the agents were able to obtain information they could never have accessed otherwise. The discussion then turns to its usefulness for military purposes. Both reports conclude that further investigation in this direction and deeper exploration of current findings are needed. At this point, we need to make one last clarification. Currently, we know that the project has been closed, but this is what we know from the declassified documents that have become public. But this does not rule out that the project still exists under another name. As we have seen, the project has actually changed various names throughout its history, and very few people were aware of its existence. Furthermore, it's curious that some of the main figures involved in the project continued their work, such as Hal Puthoff, who founded the Institute for Advanced Studies in Texas. And he continued to work as a consultant for the United States government and for private companies on issues related to advanced technologies and national security. In recent years, Puthoff has also become known for his involvement in unidentified flying object research, and he has worked with organizations such as To the Stars Academy of Arts and Science, a group that includes other former government officials and scientists interested in studying unidentified aerial phenomena. If, as we were saying, the Stargate project had the main goal of military use, it is also true that everything that has been discovered in these years inevitably raises questions about what our mind is and what consciousness is. If consciousness can really extend beyond the limits of the body and time, as the surprising experiments of the Stargate project demonstrate, then an inevitable question arises. What happens to consciousness at the moment of death? Is it possible that it survives the body? That it continues to exist on another plane? Not only ancient cultures and religions have tried to answer this question, but also many modern scientists by analyzing hundreds of cases of near-death experiences. And what does science think about death? In this case, there is no unified thought connecting the scientific community. Instead, there are opposing viewpoints. But what are its foundations? Are there any concrete elements that help us investigate this mystery?
So-called death is nothing but an old affair, in some new form and with a different dress. Because all things are transformed, but nothing dies, and here and there the spirit flies free from the body.
According to the Book of the Dead, the ancient Egyptians believed that after death, the soul left the earth and began a journey into the underworld, where a final judgment awaited the deceased before they could enter the afterlife. Osiris judged the deceased, subjecting them to a lengthy list of sins, and the truth was determined by weighing the heart of the deceased on a scale that had a feather as a counterweight. The ancient Egyptians weren't alone in believing the soul was immortal. In ancient India, people said coming and going were illusions, as the soul never truly leaves or arrives. Plato and other Greek philosophers, perhaps influenced by Eastern culture, also maintained that the soul was immortal. But this was not an idea limited to Asia and the East. Most African tribes, the Aboriginal people in Australia, and the indigenous peoples in the Americas had the same belief. For example, Julius Caesar wrote in De Bello Gallico,
"The Druids instill this as one of their fundamental dogmas, namely, that souls never die, but after death pass from one body to another. And they believe that men, thanks to this dogma, are driven to the utmost zeal. Because the fear of death has no reason to exist."
But where did this awareness of the soul's immortality come from? It was just a way to ward off the fear of death. Many historians think that this is one of the main reasons, and that this belief was just the result of men's inability, on one hand, to understand the laws of the world. Also, it's a way to reduce fear of an event that was common in daily life in less advanced societies. What if these aren't the only reasons, and we're overlooking or unable to understand the knowledge shared by these ancient cultures? Let's leave this question open and focus on today, where Western societies tend to reject the topic of death. The prevailing mindset is to ignore this event and live as if life never ends, at least for as long as that's possible. But where does our understanding of death stand? Are there concrete elements that can be investigated? The first element we can analyze is to try to understand whether death is truly the end of everything, or if it is just a passage to something unknown. The second element is to understand consciousness's true nature, and whether it results only from mechanical laws or something else. Let's begin with the first element. We don't have any accounts of people who died and then came back to life, but we do have many accounts of men, women, and children who were declared dead for several minutes and then incredibly came back to life. What if we can't discuss real death? These accounts, as we will see, have something very interesting and show extraordinary common elements that have been investigated over the years by numerous researchers. We're discussing near-death experiences. This is a fascinating, complex topic that, as we'll see, has many implications for what we think we are and know. To fully understand, let's proceed step by step from the beginning.
I was lying on the hospital bed. The ceiling light was blinding, and suddenly everything went dark, and I felt myself being lifted as if I were floating. I saw my motionless body below. A feeling of peace enveloped me, and a warm, intense light was drawing me in. I heard reassuring voices and felt a loving presence.
The first study we know of on the near-death experience dates back to 1892, and it was conducted by the Swiss geologist Albert von Sankt. He described 30 cases that were personally reported to him. Among these, we find stories of mountaineers who survived near-fatal falls, and accounts of soldiers who had suffered wounds that put their lives at risk during the war, and testimonies from ordinary workers who had fallen from scaffolding or had suffered serious accidents. Von Sankt concludes his study by stating that people who were near death or who had been considered dead, they reported not feeling any anguish and not experiencing any terror, but rather they experienced calm, acceptance, and a sense of deep serenity. But it wasn't until the 1970s that the first studies appeared in specialized journals. Studies have increasingly followed one another up to today. Among the pioneers in this field of research is Dr. Raymond Moody, whose 1975 book, Life After Life, collected testimonies from people who had experienced near-death experiences, introducing the phenomenon to the public and becoming a global bestseller. According to Moody, many people who have had a near-death experience find it difficult to describe what they experienced, as these are sensations and perceptions outside of the ordinary. One of the first sensations reported is a deep peace and absence of physical pain, accompanied by a feeling of well-being. Many describe feeling separated from their physical body, observing it from the outside, often from above. This state is followed by the sensation of moving rapidly through a dark and narrow space, similar to a tunnel. During this experience, it is common to encounter deceased people in a bright and reassuring environment. A recurring element is the vision of a bright light, perceived as loving and welcoming. Some report having experienced a panoramic review of their life, in which they see a rapid sequence of images and significant moments from their past. Near-death experiences are often characterized by a strong sense of unconditional love and acceptance, emanating from the light or the entities encountered. People often report reaching a boundary or point of no return, after which they can't return to earthly life. This often includes deciding or feeling forced to return to one's body, despite resisting leaving the peaceful place. Finally, many people after this experience report a profound change in their perception of life and all their values. They often develop an increased sense of spirituality and compassion, significantly influencing their way of living and seeing the world. Not all witnesses experience every element Moody mentioned, but these help define near-death experience characteristics. It is also useful to point out that there is no correlation between the description of these experiences and the personal or religious beliefs of the individuals involved, nor have any correlations been observed between social status or level of education. These actually happen regardless. Goodbye. One of the most investigated aspects is certainly the one in which witnesses report having had out-of-body experiences, and they report in detail all the resuscitation maneuvers and events they underwent, which they could not have known about. These accounts are very important because they can be verified, and for this reason, researchers investigate them very carefully among the many testimonies of out-of-body experiences. A notable case is the one that the renowned cardiologist Pim van Lommel described in his important work on near-death experiences, and which led to the publication of the book Consciousness Beyond Life, as well as being published in several articles in the scientific journal Lancet. In this particular episode, Van Lommel reports the verified testimony of a nurse from the coronary unit.
During the night shift, the crew of an ambulance brings in a 44-year-old man in a coma. Admitted to the coronary unit, he is artificially ventilated with a bag and mask, cardiac massage is continued, and the patient is defibrillated. When I get ready to intubate the patient, I notice that he has dentures in his mouth. Before intubating him, I remove the upper denture and place it on the emergency cart. After about 90 minutes, the patient has an adequate heart rhythm and sufficient blood pressure and is transferred to the intensive care unit. After more than a week in a coma, the patient returns to the coronary unit and I meet him when I go by for the dressings. As soon as he sees me, he says, "Oh yes, but do you know where my dentures are?" I'm left speechless, and then he says to me, "Yes, you were there when they brought me to the hospital. You took the dentures out of my mouth and put them on the cart. There were all those bottles on it and you put them in a sliding drawer." I was totally shocked because I remembered that this happened while the patient was in a deep coma and was being resuscitated. After further questions, I found out that the patient had seen himself lying in the bed and had watched from above as the nurses and doctors were resuscitating him.
Other very significant cases are out-of-body experiences, reported by witnesses with visual impairments or even those blind from birth who say they saw what was happening to them, like witness Vicky described in Ring and Cooper's book. In 1973, Vicky, a 23-year-old woman who had been blind since birth, was thrown out of the car she was traveling in during a road accident. A skull fracture and several serious injuries caused her to fall into an immediate coma. Despite being blind, the woman was able to see and recognize the car destroyed in the accident and describe it in detail. And later in the operating room, she was able not only to see her body but also to describe in detail everything that happened to it.
I had never seen anything, no lights, shadows, or anything else. A lot of people ask me if I see black. No, I don't see black. I don't see anything at all. I remember I was in the hospital and it was scary because I'm not used to seeing things since I've never done it before. I recognized my veil and my hair and I thought, that lying down over there is my body. Am I dead or what? Meanwhile, the doctors and nurses were rushing around my body and kept saying, "We can't bring her back."
But Vicky's story isn't over. She claims she heard something like the sound of little bells, and right after that she flew above the hospital ceiling and then was drawn toward a light. At that moment, she felt she was being transported to another world where she was welcomed by some acquaintances who had passed away a few years earlier, and after talking with them, she was sent back into her body. The fact that a woman who has been blind since birth and has an undeveloped visual cortex can see people, what is around her, clearly raises the question of how all this can be possible. But we'll try to answer this question in the last part of the video. First, we need to clear up some of the most common objections. Subtitles author and revision by QT says, when it comes to near-death experiences, many claim that these are experiences recorded only in recent times because they are the result of our improved abilities in healthcare and the techniques and use of drugs during the hectic phases of resuscitation. But this isn't entirely true. What we now call near-death experiences have been recorded since ancient times, even if under different names, and we find traces of them in all cultures around the world. Plato recounts the story of a soldier named who revived after being dead for 10 days. And once he woke up, he said he had left his body and traveled to another world where he saw souls being judged for their terrible sins. And what about the description found in the Tibetan tradition? Listening to these accounts, we can't help but think of modern testimonies of out-of-body experiences.
When the principle of consciousness leaves the body, it asks itself, am I dead or am I not dead? At this moment, the deceased sees that his body is being stripped of its clothes, his bed is being removed, and he can hear the crying and lamenting of friends and relatives, but even though he can see and hear them, they cannot hear him. At that point, the sounds, the lights, and the rays, all three of these things are experienced.
Another objection that is raised about the real authenticity of these experiences is that they would only be the result of hallucinations or altered states of the brain due to the shock of trauma and the use of resuscitation drugs. However, studies conducted on witnesses of near-death experiences have proven that these occur during the period of clinical death of the individual and not immediately before or right after a cardiac arrest. Determining the precise moment is important because it rules out any other conclusion except that the near-death experience occurred when all brain functions were absent. So if we start from the assumption that consciousness is the product of the brain, at the moment when it stops showing any sign of functionality, it's impossible for any signs of consciousness to occur. Studies conducted both in humans and in animals have shown that, during an induced cardiac arrest, the loss of activity in both the cerebral cortex and the brainstem causes unconsciousness. Within just a few seconds, the first signs of oxygen deprivation in the brain are recorded after only 6 seconds from a cardiac arrest. If the heartbeat doesn't resume quickly, the loss of electrical activity in the cerebral cortex causes a flat electroencephalogram, indicating no activity. We can compare the brain to a computer that has been unplugged. All its circuits are disabled, and until it is powered again, it is unable to perform any operation. With the difference, however, that a brain deprived of power for several minutes will suffer severe damage. Clearly, during a cardiac arrest, an electroencephalogram is not performed because doctors are busy with resuscitation procedures. Not to mention that many times this doesn't happen in a hospital, but in the most desperate places. But there are exceptions. There are documented cases in which a patient in cardiac arrest has their brain function analyzed at the same time. This happens, for example, during some neurosurgical procedures. So if during this kind of procedure the patient experiences a near-death experience, it's possible to have a very detailed picture of their brain function. The most famous case in which this happened is that of Pamela Reynolds, a case that has sparked a lot of discussion and that we will now look at in detail. Pamela, a 35-year-old woman, underwent a scan that revealed a gigantic aneurysm in one of her shoulders. Cerebral arteries near the brainstem. An aneurysm is a kind of balloon in a weakened spot of a blood vessel. If this bursts, a very real risk, it can cause a fatal cerebral hemorrhage. Pamela's survival chances were slim. Surgery to correct the issue was complex and risky. Neurosurgeon Robert Spetzler from Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix decided to risk everything and operate on her anyway. What happened during the operation was meticulously recorded. Pamela's body temperature was lowered to 10 degrees and she was connected to a heart-lung machine. Because of the loss of heart activity, which always occurs during cases of hypothermia is induced in order to preserve brain cells. This is because during the operation, in order to work on the aneurysm, all the blood in her head will be drained. The electrical activity of the brainstem and the cerebral cortex is monitored during all stages of the operation. The operation lasts about 6 hours and it is a success. Pamela wakes up surprising the medical staff and shares a profound near-death experience. Here are her incredible words.
I don't remember the operating room. I don't remember Dr. Spetzler. I was with one of his assistants, and then nothing. Until a sound. The sound was unpleasant. It felt like being in a dentist's office. I remember the top of my head was tingling, and somehow I popped out of the top of my head. As I moved farther from my body, the image became clearer. I remember seeing many things in the operating room, and when I looked down, I was very present. I thought it was strange how they had shaved my head. I expected them to shave all my hair, but they hadn't. I was metaphorically sitting on Dr. Spetzler's shoulder. I remember the instrument in his hand. It looked like the handle of my toothbrush. I also clearly remember a female voice saying, "We have a problem. Her arteries are too small." And then a man's voice saying, "Try." On the other side, I felt a presence. Somehow, I turned to see it. And there I saw a tiny little point of light, like a pinprick. The light began to pull me, but not against my will. I had the physical sensation of going up. It felt like going up in a very fast elevator. I realized that I was beginning to make out various figures. I saw many people I knew, and others I didn't know. But I knew that somehow I was connected to them. Everyone I saw appeared as a person can look at the best moment of their life. I saw my Uncle Jen. I was very close to him because he had taught me so many things. They didn't allow me to go any further, and they told me that if I kept going toward the light, something would happen to me physically, and they wouldn't be able to bring me back into my body anymore. I wanted to go into the light, but I also wanted to return because I had children to raise. I asked if that light was God, and they answered me, "No, God is not the light. The light is what happens when God breathes." I remember thinking, I'm in the breath of God. It was my uncle who brought me back, but when I got to where my body was and I looked at that thing, I definitely didn't want to go back, because it seemed a lot like something that was lifeless. My uncle started arguing with me. He told me it's like diving into a pool, just jump in. He pushed me and I saw my body jump and I felt the cold inside me. I was back in my body. It was painful.
Everything that Pamela says she saw matches incredibly well with what actually happened that day in the operating room. These are the words of Dr. Spetzler.
During the arrest, Pamela's brain was found to be dead. In all 3 clinical tests, the electroencephalogram was silent, her brainstem responses were absent, and there was no blood flow in her brain. I don't think the observations he made were based on what he might have seen when entering the operating room. The instruments were not visible to her. I have no explanation for this. I don't know how it's possible that it happened, considering the physiological state she was in. At the same time, I've seen many things happen that I can't explain, and I don't want to be so arrogant as to say that there's no way they could happen.
After hearing this incredible testimony, we can't help but wonder how all of this could have happened during a period of clinical death. Should we perhaps think that consciousness is something not strictly connected to the brain? And what does science say about this? To answer these questions, we must take a complex journey, which will simplify as much as possible. But it presents a revolutionary new vision of everything we thought we knew. What isn't true remains untrue. It's commonly believed our brain's mechanics create consciousness. For example, we have measured how there is a 30% increase in blood flow in the brain. When you think or pay attention to something, this happens because neurons use more energy to bring brain processes to life. Having observed this, we might be led to believe that it is therefore certain and proven that our consciousness is the result of brain activity. But in reality, despite what we observe, even today we have no direct evidence proving that neurons produce our consciousness. Let's try to explain this concept better. For decades, scientists have tried to locate memories and consciousness in the brain. The initial assumption was that activity in specific neural areas would always give rise to the same thoughts and emotions, but this research has never had positive results. Today we know that there is a correlation between the activity recorded in the brain and the experience of consciousness, and that this can activate many brain centers. But a connection doesn't say anything about what the cause is. Brain activity seems more like a way of encoding information. Let's think about a radio. We can search for radio stations by turning the knob that adjusts the frequency reception, but doing this doesn't influence the content of the radio broadcast. From this perspective, the activation of a specific part of the brain doesn't explain the contents of thoughts and emotions. What we can measure is only the correlation between the activities recorded in the brain and conscious experiences. Philosopher and neuroscientist Alva Noe writes this in a recent book.
The idea that we are our brain is not something that scientists have studied. Rather, it's a preconception that consciousness arises in the brain. It's something that is never questioned. It's an indisputable starting assumption, but today we have every reason to reject this prejudice.
An event that sparked much debate in the scientific world. It's the one reported in an article published in the prestigious scientific journal Science with a provocative title, "Is Your Brain Really Necessary?" And it reports a truly unusual case. The brain scan of a young mathematics graduate with an intelligence quotient of 126, which is above average. It reportedly revealed that 95% of his skull was filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and his cerebral cortex measured only 2 millimeters thick. The weight of his remaining brain was estimated at 100 grams compared to the 1,500 grams of a normal brain. Despite all this, his brain functions remained unimpaired, prompting inevitable reflection. All the information and short and long-term memory, all the emotions and thoughts of this young man, where were they physically stored? If his brain mass was found to be extremely small, is it possible that the answer is only related to the brain's plasticity? That is, its ability to cope with and adapt to structural changes, and therefore develop more efficient connections? Or instead, should we imagine that memory and thoughts are not physically located in the brain mass, but that they have another location? Before answering these questions, let's revisit near-death experiences. Among the experiences reported by witnesses, There is the one of reliving their own life, literally seeing it flash before their eyes. But not only that, many say they felt outside time and space.
It was enough to think of a place or a specific event from their life to instantly find themselves living that moment in that specific place.
Beyond this, witnesses report that they strongly felt everything seemed to be connected to everything else, in a close interconnection. In those moments, the mind seems to contain the knowledge of everything, in a dimension without time and without space.
In that moment, I understood why I was there, the reason for my illness. I understood in general what life is. I understood that we were all part of something unique. It was all so obvious. The clarity and the ability to understand that I had in that state are simply indescribable.
If we relate these elements to our current scientific knowledge, and specifically in the ability to be in a certain place instantly and in the perception of an intrinsic connection with everything, what comes to mind? It's clear that one can't help but think of quantum physics and its revolutionary concepts. For example, quantum entanglement describes how two particles can remain connected in such a way that a change in the state of one instantly affects the other. Independently, this phenomenon might remind us of the experience of being in a place instantly, simply by thinking about it in the same way. Zero-point field theory proposes a universal energy present throughout space and time, evoking the idea of an intrinsic connection between all things, similar to the sense of universal connection reported in near-death experiences. These parallels prompt us to reconsider traditional views on consciousness and reality, suggesting that we may be only at the beginning of deeply understanding the nature of our existence and our mind. Let's now imagine that the brain is like a television. The television is the device that receives signals and transforms them into images and sounds, allowing us to watch and listen to television programs. However, the content we see on the screen is not produced inside the television itself. Instead, it is transmitted by an external television station through electromagnetic waves. In the same way, we could consider the brain as a receiver or a decoder of consciousness signals, rather than the producer of consciousness. In this view, consciousness and information do not physically reside in the brain, just as television programs are not physically inside the television. The brain, like the television, interprets and decodes these signals, allowing us to experience thoughts, memories, and perceptions. Now imagine that your consciousness, normally tuned to the channel of the here and now through the brain, temporarily disconnects from this physical state. During a near-death experience, it's as if the television is turned off or unplugged from its normal power source, allowing consciousness to tune into a different channel or state of existence. In this new state, consciousness is no longer limited by the physical barriers of the body and brain, but is free to explore other dimensions of reality. Those who have had a near-death experience often describe the sensation of leaving their own body, of moving through a tunnel toward a bright light and feeling connected to a greater universal energy. This passage seems temporary, as many return to their physical form with vivid memories of what they experienced. This suggests that consciousness can exist independently from the physical body, operating on a different level, similar to how a television might tune into a new signal or channel. If we look at our physiology, we also know that our cells and neurons are constantly regenerating. Cellular regeneration is a well-documented phenomenon. For example, skin cells renew themselves every 2 weeks, while liver cells regenerate about every 6 months. Even the neurons in the brain undergo changes, despite the myth that neurons are static or that neurogenesis does not occur. New neurons form mainly in the hippocampus, which is linked to memory. This raises a fundamental problem. If neurons regenerate and change, where exactly do our thoughts, memories, and emotions reside? How can they be stored in structures that are constantly changing? Simply put, today it is believed that during regeneration, brain structures are rewritten and in some ways updated. This would be the reason why we don't lose the information stored in them. But is it possible instead that memory, thoughts, and emotions, rather than physically residing in neural connections, are actually found in that electromagnetic field we record when we observe brain activity? The brain, then, would not be the generator of our consciousness, but rather a tool we use to perceive it. Going back to near-death experiences, it is possible then that when our brain shuts down, our consciousness tunes into a different frequency. This is the experience that thousands of witnesses from all over the world report having had. One of the key theories of Van Lommel is the concept of non-local consciousness. He proposes that consciousness is not confined to the brain, but is a fundamental aspect of the universe. Similar to quantum phenomena, the brain functions as a receiver or an interface for this non-local consciousness, rather than originating it. This idea aligns with the discoveries of quantum physics, suggesting that consciousness may operate beyond the conventional limits of time and space.
People experience unconsciousness in a dimension where time and space no longer play a role. Everything is there. The past, present, and future are contained within this dimension of consciousness. The dimension is unconditional love and wisdom. In this dimension, there is only the subject, and everything is instantly connected.
What is puzzling in some ways is that if Van Lommel's studies, and not just his, are correct, they are simply confirming ancient beliefs that mankind has always held. At the start of the video, we referenced ancient texts, but many myths also describe the journey from life to death.
Listen, when the breath ceases, the vital force will sink into the nerve center of wisdom, and the one who knows will experience the clear light of the natural state. In that moment, do not be afraid of that clear, bright, dazzling yellow light, but know that it is wisdom.
What if the answer to humanity's greatest riddle was revealed in an ancient tradition whose origin we have lost, but which, in different forms and ways, has always been before our eyes? Clearly, we don't have a definitive answer to this question, but as we've seen in this video, there are many clues that deserve to be investigated and explored further. At this point, we are really curious to know your opinion or your experiences regarding the topic we discussed today. Write in the comments what you think, and if you like the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support our work.